They didn't want to go fight in the war that was happening, and they had new ideas about what the world was really about. Some of that change involved technology, and as a matter of fact, some nerds were working really hard to make the first ever microchip, and some other nerd was a really big fan of this new microchip thing. But before we get to this guy, there's someone else we have to talk about who is arguably even more important to the creation of Apple. Steve Wozniak was a student who loved computers and everything about them. He would read books about their inner circuitry, work out problems by himself just as a hobby, and it was his dream to own a personal computer. But back then, it was tough, because at the time, computers looked like this. And that's not very personal if you ask me. But this changed in 1974 when the first ever personal computer was released, which looked like shit. Yeah, it didn't really do anything. It was a simple box with some flashing lights that you could program and make the lights flash in different orders. We had a long way to go. But luckily for us, but it seemed like it also blew the mind of nerds across the world, causing computer clubs and universities to form. They would come together and fiddle with this thing, discuss the inner workings of its technology, and ponder the future of computers as a whole. One of these clubs was in San Francisco, the Homebrew Computer Club, where students would bring their own little inventions using the technology available at the time. This club was the very one our good pal Steve Wozniak was a part of. And wait, who's that? Steve Jobs was also home to this very same computer club, and after he watched this Steve Wozniak guy bring in his own computer week after week, the Steves eventually went up to one another and said, hey, maybe we should sell these things. Now you're probably thinking they came up with something brilliant in the garage which they called a workshop, but in 1975 the two boys released this thing. Yeah, that's right. This was actually the first device that these two geniuses ever worked on. It was a simple tool that could help you make long-distance calls without having to pay. But that thing didn't take off, so they went back to the garage and made the Apple I. It didn't have a screen, it didn't have a mouse, it didn't have a keyboard, but it was able to run Angry Birds. Just kidding. The Apple I was just a circuit board that could basically do some simple calculations, and it cost a fortune at the time. 200 were ever made and 50 were sold, which resulted in a little over $30,000. Nice! Okay, well, we still have a little ways to go. $30,000 at the time wasn't bad at all. And this was all the proof that Steve Jobs needed. He knew that the future would have people that love computers, but not everyone who loves the idea of using a computer would be able to build it themselves. And the Apple I didn't really fit that new narrative, and so the two set off to make the Apple II. This time, they went with a different approach. They wanted to build a computer that was sold as the full package, instead of the previous one, which was only a circuit board. The problem was, it was impossible with the technology at the time. But wait, Steve Wozniak didn't believe that. He started combining different chips and looked through manuals to find chips that could multitask. After doing that over and over, a few times later he ended up with a computer that had very few chips. Not only could this one do the same simple calculations as the Apple I, but it was also able to produce colored graphics and patterns right on the built-in screen. Cool! It's cheaper to produce, more compact, and it's even more capable than the Apple I, but it is still ugly. It's still a hunk of chips and wires, and it looked pretty threatening to someone who isn't a wizard with computers. And that's where Steve Jobs comes in. While Wozniak was the engineer behind the computers, Steve Jobs was the marketer. He was one of the first people in the world to realize that technology was not just a tool, but it could also form a personal connection with the user.
You can have many views of what a computer is. My particular view is that a computer is a new medium.
He knew just how to make something look nice, and he also knew how to sell it to people. So they fit all of this junk into a sleek, simple, friendly casing that made the computer very inviting to general consumers. And with the new design, it was clear they had no problem selling it to people because the Apple II was released in 1977, and by the end of its production life, it had sold 6 million units. Apple was now worth approximately $2 billion, which was a lot of money at the time, but that's still pretty far from what we know it as today. Due to the success, it was time for the company to kick into high gear. New management came in, and on December 12, 1980, Apple was put onto the public stock market, selling 4.6 million shares at $22 per share. By the end of the day, it's said that 300 millionaires were created with all of the people who owned these shares of Apple at the time, and things only went up from here. Just kidding. Soon after, they released the Apple III, and it was famous for being unreliable and buggy. Then they released the Lisa, which was the very first computer with a graphical user interface, just like the one you're using right now. Pretty cool, right? Apparently not. They didn't really make any good apps for it, and the computer itself was super expensive, so nobody bought it. Plus, while they were busy making Lisa, they kicked Steve Jobs off the team due to intercompany fighting. This thing sucks. I'm just gonna make the same thing, but better. And so he did. He literally said that and went on to make one of the most successful computers of all time. A computer you might know, the Macintosh. It was basically the Lisa, a computer that had a graphical user interface, or GUI for short. But this time, it was cheaper. They premiered an ad for it during the Super Bowl, and everyone called it the greatest ad of all time. And sales boomed, but then they tapered off because the reviews came out. The Macintosh still kind of sucked. It was slow, couldn't really do much, and people thought it was super expensive. And this made Steve Jobs angry. Remember when I said that new management came in? Well, one of those guys was from Pepsi, John Scully. And because of the Macintosh's criticisms, John and Steve started arguing. Do you want to sell sugar water for the rest of your life, or come with me and change the world? Just get out of here. And so Steve was taken out of the position as head of Macintosh. You want me to leave? Well, I'm leaving. By the way, the other Steve is gone too. And so Steve Jobs left to do some other stuff with this little old company called Next. Wow, look at these computers, man. They can make 3D animations? Nobody's ever seen this before. Wow, you could probably make something cool with this kind of technology. Oh my gosh. Toy Story? That's amazing. Let's check back at Apple and see what's happening without Steve Jobs and Wozniak. Oh. Okay, the Macintosh 512K. A little bit of a weird name. I mean, that's cool. It has some cool publishing applications, I guess. Man, they are really raising the price of it, though. I hope that doesn't come back to bite them in the... Oh shit. How the hell are we supposed to get here? Well, Apple kept making computers, but they were just missing that spark that people like Jobs and Wozniak brought to the company. Sure, they made some pretty powerful stuff and started to lower their prices as the technology became more available. They even started to get into the other entertainment markets like CDs and game systems. Actually, we probably shouldn't talk about the game system. They had a new CEO, Gil Amelia, and he started to make some changes to help the failing company. But something was coming. Something really bad.
Hello, I'm Bill Gates, chairman of Microsoft.
Microsoft started making computers, and they started making computers that were cheaper than Apple and just as good. The Apple computers were expensive and boring, and even though the Microsoft ones were also boring, at least they were cheaper. Not only was Microsoft on their tail, but it seemed like everyone was just getting into the computer markets, and the demand for Apple devices was becoming smaller and smaller. Apple was just weeks away from bankruptcy, and this was it for Gil. Okay, we gotta get him back. And so Apple purchased Next in 1996 for $400 million. And with Next, they also got back Steve Jobs, which immediately made Gil resign, where Jobs then became the CEO in 1997. He threw 70% of the company's projects in the garbage, fired 3,000 people, and with the extra money that was now saved, he bought a bunch of companies that were making Apple clone computers. Now that they worked for him, it was time to put all of their brains together to make the best computer possible. On May 6, 1998, Apple introduced their newest all-in-one computer reminiscent of the original Macintosh, the iMac. By the way, keep that I in mind for later. The iMac was a huge success, with 800,000 units sold in the first 5 months, and it was responsible for major shifts in the industry. It used USB, it could connect to the internet right out of the box, and it just looked cool. Like I said before, Steve Jobs was the guy to make things marketable, and he brought back Apple's spark. A year later, in 1999, they made the iBook, which is pretty much the iMac, but in laptop form. But that name was a little bit weird though. Maybe they'll work on it. Remember when people complained that the original Macintosh didn't have enough apps? Well, this time they fixed it. Steve Jobs was coming off the tail of his movie career, and he wanted to bring that fun to Apple. They made video editing software, DVD burners, music making software, and also one that allowed you to listen to those CDs that you owned called iTunes. Apple was now building a little ecosystem of devices and software. But where were they going to sell this stuff? Oh, they just opened a store. Okay, cool. Maybe that'll take off. Who knows? Anyways, iTunes was cool and all, but who the heck sits at their desk and just listens to music? Don't you want to, like, I don't know, go outside? Maybe you want to listen to music while you're exercising or on the bus or something. We need some kind of, I don't know, a device that's mobile.
We have something really exciting for you. We lured you here today with the promise of unveiling a breakthrough digital device. It's not a Mac, and that's exactly what we're going to do. And we are introducing a product today that takes us exactly there, and that product is called iPod.
The iPod is here. 100 million units sold in 6 years. It was massively successful. The iTunes Store became a thing, allowing you to buy songs on the internet that you could take with you anywhere. Apple was now valued at $72 billion. We're back on track, baby. But to be honest, we're still really far from that other number. You know, $3 trillion? But hey, maybe we can get there with this mobile device thing. I mean, the iPod is pretty cool, but what if it could do more? Maybe like, make phone calls or something? Nah, I saw this thing called the BlackBerry and it kind of sucks. There's this tiny little keyboard, it's too hard to use, and it's trying to do way too much at once. But I just made a prototype of what an Apple phone could look like. It's too big. No one will want to carry this chunky thing around in their pocket. My grandma can make a better design. How about I just make it a bit smaller? Can we sell it then? I mean, you could try.
This is a day I've been looking forward to for 2.5 years. Every once in a while, a revolutionary product comes along that changes everything. Today, we're introducing 3 things: a widescreen iPod with touch controls, a revolutionary mobile phone, and a breakthrough internet communications device. An iPod, a phone. Are you getting it? These are not 3 separate devices. This is one device. And we are calling it iPhone. Today, Apple is going to reinvent the phone.
The iPhone sold 270,000 units in 30 hours. It was Apple's most successful device launch in history. Apple Computer Incorporated was renamed to Apple Inc. due to the company's shift in priorities. Mobile devices were the future. This device was called a game changer for the industry. It was a camera, it was a personal planner, created the iPad, and millions of kids across the globe bought it just to watch it. Apple kept releasing iterations of the iPhone year after year and continued to make their own applications such as FaceTime and iMessages, building their ecosystem up more and more as their valuation just kept skyrocketing. Apple became the most valuable consumer-facing business in the world, and it was looking unstoppable. Unfortunately, there was a problem.
As some of you may know, about 5 months ago, I had a liver transplant. I'd like to take a moment and thank everybody in the Apple community for the heartfelt support I got.
In 2011, Steve Jobs announced that he would be leaving the company to focus on his health. The COO of Apple, Tim Cook, took over Jobs' day-to-day operations at Apple. In a surprise, Steve Jobs took the stage in 2011 to announce iCloud for the last time.
So, I get to talk about iCloud. We've been working on this for some time now, and we're really excited about it.
And on October 5th, 2011, Steve Jobs died from complications with cancer. It was time for a new era of Apple. With Tim Cook leading the charge, he was determined to keep Jobs' dream alive. Innovation was still non-stop, and the company was only about to get larger. In 2012, Apple released the iPhone 4S with Siri, the first digital voice assistants that had everyone going crazy. They released the iPhone 5 with better displays, the iPad mini, the MacBook Pro, a new iMac, and a Mac mini. In 2012, Apple was valued at a record $624 billion. They worked with Dr. Dre to make some sick headphones. In 2014, they announced the Apple Watch. In 2016, Apple announced that over 1 billion Apple devices were in active use worldwide. In 2017, they made smart speakers, streaming services, and funded their own films. But in 2017, they changed the look of the iPhone forever with the iPhone X, removing the home button and completely changing the way that the phone felt. The company was valued at over $2 trillion by the end of 2020. Now we're cooking. We're almost to where we're at today. But speaking of cooking, what does Tim Cook have to say? Looks like we've got the phones down, but something's wrong with the other side of things. We keep ignoring our MacBooks and iMacs. I mean, look at them. They're built with parts that aren't even ours. We literally just put the things together and make the shell. So Apple threw out all of the Intel processors and produced the Apple M1 chip. It was faster, more efficient, and overall more powerful than all of the other their previous models. And hey, look at that. The price of the computers actually became cheaper because Apple was making the chips themselves. This was one of the last pieces to the Apple puzzle. We're pretty much at present day. We've hit our $3 trillion valuation mark. The iPhone is at its peak, and so is the Mac lineup. But hold on, what's this? Apple filing trademarks for something called Reality OS, and a bunch of other virtual reality technology along with AI. Huh. It looks like there's just one more thing. The Apple Vision Pro is here, and for the first time in a while, we've got a brand new Apple device. It's not a phone, it's not a computer, it is something completely different. Just look back at where the iPhone and Mac lineups were and how it's ended up now. Apple has come this far, so who's to say that this brand new line of products won't take them even further? And I'm going to keep you up to date with all of this. So make sure to subscribe and watch this video next where I talk all about the brand new Apple Vision Pro.
I've just bought every single Nintendo home console ever. We've got a TV from the time of each one's release, and even the main Super Mario games for every single one. So let's see how much better the gaming experience has become. Nintendo's first home console, the NES, couldn't have come at a worse time than this. The company had huge success with their arcade machines, but when it finally came to entering the living room in the early 1980s, the entire video game market just so happened to be experiencing what's still known as the Great Video Game Crash of 1983. Put simply, everyone was making games consoles. There had become far too many to choose from, and every single one had their own separate, confusing selection of rushed, poor-quality games. The entire reputation of a video game console was the worst that it had ever been, to the point where critics were even saying that gaming is a fad and that the entire concept would actually die out in a couple of years. But this didn't put Nintendo off, and in fact they did something very clever to try and spin it to their advantage. They created a games console that looked nothing like a games console, and they called it the Nintendo Entertainment System to avoid the stigma that came with the term video game. They even bundled two controllers in the box to make it more of a family living room item than something just for the solo game. This was a calculated move. This entire package is so unbelievably old that it almost just looks alien, doesn't it? The controllers, the types of cables and the adapters you find here, none of it even resembles what we use today.
I can't believe I'm about to switch on a console from 1985. And this TV, I've never seen anything like it. And apparently it turns on by... No, let's try that again. Now we turn the console on. Wait, what? The game is booted up the second you turn the power button. And you've actually got physical dials to be able to adjust the picture profile on the screen. This entire thing is just so satisfying. This is going to sound ridiculous, but bear with me here. Because with a 1.7 megahertz processor, a whole 2 kilobytes of RAM, and a maximum resolution of 240p, the NES was actually spec like a next-gen machine when compared to the Atari 2600 that people were playing before. And as a huge fan of just video games in general, the easiest part of this for me is that this console is the console where Nintendo launched the first ever Zelda game, and more importantly, the first ever Mario game. Let's plug the Player 1 controller in. Oh my gosh. This feels like such a moment in gaming history. Like, imagine if you could have taken the small group of developers that made this and showed them what Mario would actually become today. You can hear that same jump sound even in today's games. It's crazy that the entire game basically works with one face button. The text itself is kind of hard to read because of how low the resolution is, but the game is very playable even today. Regardless, this little red cover was an instant hit. And when you combine Mario with the console's beautiful clean graphics, its branding as a must-have toy instead of a games console, as well as its rock-bottom price of $250 in today's money, you can probably see how it became the most popular console in history, selling 61.9 million units, which was enough that Nintendo had arguably saved the entire video game industry. That by the time they decided to release the NES's successor, they didn't even have to worry about a dying market anymore.
and what a success it was. The Super Nintendo Entertainment System, released about 5 years later at a much higher price tag of $450 in today's money, was basically an NES with every aspect dialed up to the max. For starters, the controller was probably the single most important controller ever made, bringing in a smoother, more hand-friendly design, 2 extra face buttons, X and Y, that set the standard for how all future controllers will be made, and also shoulder buttons. All controllers up until this point relied almost entirely on your thumbs as the only input. This controller is what made gamers realize that actually every single finger could be an input, and this would allow for games with a new tier of complexity. Whether it be drifting in Super Mario Kart, or aiming your arm cannon diagonally in Super Metroid. Yeah, Nintendo loved using the word Super. It was basically their way of saying next gen. There's a similarly enormous set of cables and adapters to last time, then the SNES itself, which is actually lighter than I expected for something that's an absolute beast in performance. And I'm not exaggerating when I use the term beast. The way to calculate graphics power is a little complex for these early consoles, but just to give you an idea of how much more capable it could be, the SNES had 64 times the amount of RAM versus their last machine.
What is it with the pull tabs on these old TVs? I love the clickiness of everything. It's also so crazy that this is what the games used to look like. And then to turn the console on, there was a switch. And then Nintendo Switch. Ah, it's so much better. The music in this video is giving me chills. And it's also noticeably higher resolution music than the last console.
In a way, the SNES was the pinnacle of 2D gaming, just before the 3D era. With this much power, developers could basically make any 2D game they wanted to. So if we compare Super Mario World on the SNES versus Super Mario Bros. On the NES,
the backgrounds feel so more alive,
with multiple layers moving at different speeds as you walk to simulate things being closer and further away from you.
It's also a shocking amount sharper.
Like, text on this is barely readable. This one has like no problems at all. And objects also have proper lighting and shadows for the first time ever. Now that that has become my benchmark, I can almost feel the wonder that people must have felt when stepping into this game for the first time.
Why am I excited by the fact that Mario has a new spinny jump?
The SNES didn't quite trounce the sales figures of the original NES, but for a console released only a few years later, the fact that it still sold 49 million units is nothing to be scoffed at. But with consoles like Sony's first PlayStation leading the charge into 3D gaming very shortly after, Nintendo had to find a way to keep up. Enter the Nintendo 64, named after its new 64-bit chip that could now process data in larger chunks at a time, making it perfect for 3D. This box is so wacky, I love it. And the controller, equally so. But as much as it does look like something Batman might throw at a villain's face, this was just as big of a deal as the SNES controller. Thanks to the invention of the analog stick by a Nintendo employee, you're going to start to notice a theme in this video, that even more so than the machines themselves, the key to Nintendo's console success is all about controller innovation. And then we've got the console, which is almost as weird looking as the controller. Now here's the thing, the Nintendo 64 had all the ingredients for this slander of the console. Firstly, as you might have guessed by how it's literally named after its new processor, this was the most powerful console in the world. The fact that we had a 64-bit processor in a machine that was literally $300 in today's money, this was almost science fiction. And it made this thing approximately 30 times more powerful than the SNES. Or what's even harder to grasp, 1,920 times more powerful than the NES.
Why is there a button here? It makes no sense.
The analog stick was a game changer. The analog stick made the Nintendo 64 the most natural way to traverse 3D environments. Plus, the biggest thing that separated Nintendo from other console titans like Sony and Microsoft was the fact that they weren't just console designers, they were game developers. So they never just made the box and then hoped lots of great games were made for it. They made the box and the main game that you want to buy with it. I'm just now realizing this has 4 controller ports compared to 2 on every past console. The N64 was home to truly legendary games like Zelda Ocarina of Time, GoldenEye, and Super Mario 64.
I bet we're gonna test it. Thankfully a TV, I understand.
I love these switches. And the other upside is that to a pet, you can no longer turn your gaming console off. You can actually see it take a minute to get to the right level of brightness.
Oh my gosh.
I can't even begin to describe the difference here. Mario 64 might just be the most influential video game ever. You can see how Mario 64 was the proof of concept for how future 3D worlds would work, how you'd be able to move within them, how the camera would follow you, and how you'd be able to interact with objects inside of it. Remember, this is all new. You could argue that SNES games have actually aged better, because 2D games that look like that are still a thing now, whereas 3D games that look like this are not. But putting myself in the shoes of someone whose best gaming experience so far was that, and handing them this, I would have paid to see their reactions. So why didn't it do better? Even with all of this going for it, the N64 only managed to sell 32.9 million units in its lifetime, which almost makes it seem like Nintendo is trying so hard for nothing. And to put it simply, it's because they now had a major competitor in the form of PlayStation. The PS1, while not as capable on paper, beat Nintendo to market with a 3D capable machine by a full 2 years, which was enough of a lead that all the pioneers who really wanted a 3D console, they all had it. This was no doubt extremely frustrating for Nintendo. So when it came time for their follow-up console, the GameCube, they made sure that they released closer to the next PlayStation, the PS2, and they made sure that they used a similar disc-based format, and they made sure that when it came to power, they beat it. And that with the machine itself, they outdid them completely. This is a very meaty console. Everything in this box is just much denser than before. The wiring, the controller that looks like it's from another planet, and of course the machine itself. It genuinely gives off the vibe of a mini supercomputer, apart from the cute little handle on top that also makes it look like a lunchbox. But the console does send a very clear message. You want to play 3D games with incredible graphics? This is the box you need. And it has the specs to back it up too. Compared to the N64, it's approximately 5 times more powerful.
You ready for yet another nostalgia hit? Oh my gosh. It's the GameCube screen. You can instantly tell it's higher resolution. Gotta say, Nintendo was definitely playing the weird card here. Nothing about this controller makes any sense. Like, only one side of the controller has 2 shoulder buttons. The second analog stick is so tiny and strange. And the face buttons too. What is this arrangement? The shoulder buttons travel so far, and then when you get to the bottom they have this click. That's so nice. I can see why people still use this thing today. Simba is behind the consoles. Please don't unplug anything. There we go. This is an enormous jump. Like, the amount of effects on display here is a world above. The water looks amazing. And you can even feel how hot it is in the game because of how heat distorts things that are further away. The resolution is 480p, or 4.5 times the number of pixels versus the N64, which is an enormous jump. But I wouldn't say it looks 4.5 times as sharp, which is at least in part due to the fact that the N64 was designed with CRT TVs in mind. And also the fact that with later consoles, Nintendo's opted for a smoother, more refined look. I almost feel bad for Nintendo, because even with the intense focus on trying to make the best console they possibly could, even with an exceptional controller and a pretty reasonable price of $330 in today's money, the GameCube sold even worse than the N64, with a total of 21.75 million units. And you could point to the lack of online gaming as a reason, or maybe the fact that the GameCube focused too much on Nintendo's own games and lacked third-party support. But I think the crux of it was just the competition. The PS2 it was up against sold like nothing we've ever seen before, at 158 million units. Not to mention, Xbox had just joined the battle too, with huge games like Halo and Fable further squeezing Nintendo's share of the game. But this failure taught Nintendo their most important lesson yet. It's time to talk. And if you're enjoying this video, then a sub to the channel would be really good. It took until this point, 2006, for Nintendo to realize that they didn't want to compete with PlayStation and Xbox anymore. But more importantly, that they didn't need to. That the joy of gaming didn't require the most chunky, extreme-powered machine. And so with this console, there was a complete paradigm shift in thinking. This is when Nintendo started focusing on fun. And in doing so, created their most successful, widely appealing console ever. In fact, without even unboxing the console, you can already see how they managed to appeal to the everyday person who might not even call themselves a gamer. This is the most organized console package I've ever seen, with 2 drawers to separate the different sets of parts. And it comes with literally everything. An enormous operations manual, a stand to keep the console upright. There's yet another controller that had never been seen before, and arguably the craziest one yet, even a case to protect the controller. Who does that? These companies make so much money off players breaking their controllers and then having to buy new ones. But there's more. You've got the sensor bar to detect motion from your controllers, a couple of cables for power and connection to the TV, and then the machine itself. And this is also very different. You can probably tell by how it only takes up a small part of the overall package. The console's tiny size, its simple design. There's far less about trying to look like a high-end gaming rig like most consoles, about trying to blend in. That the promise of the Wii
isn't really about the console. The hardware itself is only a 1.27 times improvement over the GameCube, which by gaming console standards is completely unheard of. This must have been a very scary move for Nintendo to make, because each generation up until this point was all about power. More power was the entire way that you could offer gamers more possibilities within your games. And while Nintendo was sat here making 1.27 times improvements, Sony and Microsoft were making 20, 30x improvements to their hardware. But what it all came down to is this. This was when Nintendo's continuous focus on controller innovation finally paid off.
You'll notice it looks a lot like a TV remote, and that even the Wii's interface looks like a TV's interface, with each app being a channel that you had to point your remote at. None of this was an accident. Given that Nintendo was now purposefully giving up on a traditional hardcore console gamer, they needed to make sure that this console was as simple as possible for the new, more casual audience they were now going after.